Obsession. Written by Johnny Fist. Rico was obsessed. He always carried out his work with ferocity and unmatched dedication. He loved it more than anything in the world. Whenever he received a new assignment, a new investigation for La Bouche newspaper, he threw himself into the task without hesitation and with complete commitment. Because of this, he had earned both trouble and an enviable reputation. But as a journalist, Rico was incomparable. Having climbed to the 9th floor of the hotel, he laid out all his equipment and drew the curtains shut. Extra eyes were unnecessary. Opening his case, Rico pulled out a listening device and a pack of cigarettes. Lighting one, he began assembling the bugging equipment. The listening device resembled a rifle, with one difference. At the end of the barrel sat a sensitive microphone capable of capturing directed sound from 20 meters away. For Rico, that wasn't nearly enough, but it was the best he had managed to acquire on such short notice. His target was located on the 7th floor of the building opposite. A road stretched between them. But at least there were no trees or other obstacles. Just an open street. That was precisely why Rico had immediately shut the curtains. Even on the 9th floor, everything could easily be seen from below. Rico's target was millionaire and shadow investor to the government, François Leclerc. Rico had been offered a substantial sum to tail him and dig up something juicy. He hadn't needed asking twice. Besides, such an article could make him famous throughout all of France, on top of the money. So he took the job without a second thought. One thing about the case remained problematic. Leclerc loved appearing in public and in crowded places. And that posed a problem, because all secret dealings are done in secret, not in public. During a full week of surveillance, Rico had failed to catch Leclerc doing anything suspicious. Nor did today inspire much hope. But word had spread that Leclerc was expecting a meeting with some important figure. Yet the building he currently occupied hardly looked like a place for meetings. It would have made more sense to meet in the neighboring hotel attached to the building, a 5-star hotel, comfortable and discreet. Rico positioned his rifle so only the edge protruded through the window, avoiding attention. He connected it to a cassette recorder and put on his headphones. Now came the hardest part. Aiming through the optical sight at the correct window and praying to God that Leclerc's window would be open, that the distance wouldn't prove too great, and that he might hear something. Paris in May was unbearably hot. Never in Rico's 39 years in the city had it been this scorching, but these last few days had become almost impossible to endure. When Rico finally aimed at the correct window, he spotted Leclerc inside. Thank God. The window was open. Adjusting the volume lever, Rico listened carefully, trying to make out the words. A few turns right, then left. There. Leclerc's voice. Impossible to mistake. Low, rasping. The voice of a man who had spent most of his life with a cigar between his teeth. The sound quality was dreadful. Rico had to strain hard to understand anything, better adjust the sensitivity and search for the right position. Maybe he could improve it. He immediately switched on the tape recorder and the cassette began spinning. It was the newest and most advanced recorder available. Rico had paid a fortune for it. It had cost him 3 Thursdays at the club without beer. But it had been worth every penny. More than once the thing had saved him. He hoped it wouldn't fail him today. After tweaking the boom controls, Leclerc's voice became clearer in the headphones. Excellent. That would do. Now all that remained was to wait and listen. For 10 minutes, Leclerc spoke only about routine matters. Nothing interesting. During that time, Rico smoked 3 cigarettes. A bad sign. Usually when things stayed too quiet, he could smoke 3 entire packs. Naturally, it hadn't done his health any favors. Below, out on the street, came shouting, screaming sirens and the roar of engines. Rico quickly pulled the weapon back inside and looked out the window. He couldn't believe his eyes. The motorcade of France's Minister of Finance was approaching the hotel. There was no mistaking it. Rico knew him well. All of France did. Instead of black classic French cars, there were 5 white American-made vehicles. Only one man in the country allowed himself such extravagance. Rico became curious where he was heading, and his surprise only deepened when the convoy stopped outside the hotel and the minister himself stepped out and disappeared inside. Now that was interesting. Rico stubbed out his cigarette and aimed once more at Leclerc's room. Through the optics, he saw Leclerc's assistant approach him and announce that the minister is in the building. So that was it. Could he really have got this lucky? Silence settled inside Leclerc's room. All that remained was to understand why the minister was in the hotel, while Leclerc stayed in the neighboring building. Why hadn't they simply met in the hotel? Then again, journalists like Rico would have caught them immediately, and the minister would have spent months explaining himself. Leclerc's reputation was infamous across France. The minister's security spread out beneath the hotel, carefully surveying the surroundings, which meant they hadn't checked the neighboring buildings in advance. The meeting had been spontaneous. Now Rico's main task was not to expose himself or his listening device. Everything had suddenly become far more exciting. He loved that. The higher the stakes, the sweeter the victory. Peering through the scope of his rifle, Rico jerked back from the eyepiece in astonishment. He could hardly believe what he'd seen. The Minister of Economy had entered Leclerc's room and greeted him warmly, which meant there was a secret passage connecting the 2 buildings through the hotel. No other explanation existed. Rico cast a quick glance at the tape recorder. It continued recording steadily. If this worked out, it would be a sensation. Once more he aimed his weapon. The voices were not especially loud, but perfectly clear. During the next 10 minutes, Rico could scarcely believe what he was hearing. This was worth money, very big money. The Minister of Economy spoke eloquently, while Leclerc only occasionally interrupted, but the substance of the conversation promised consequences. For France, for the government, and for Rico. As the conversation progressed, Rico realized it was nearing its end. Damn, a photograph would be invaluable. If the article appeared with photographs and a full transcript of the conversation, he could aim not merely for the front spread, but an entire special edition. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Rico quickly balanced the listening rifle on its case so it continued capturing voices. Then he dug into his bag and pulled out a camera. Yes, the distance was great, but with some work in development, something useful might emerge. Technology allowed for that nowadays. Even film cameras could zoom 5 or 7 times. Intoxicated by anticipation and visions of success, Rico completely forgot caution. He pushed the camera through the curtain, focused the lens, zoomed all the way in, and pressed the shutter. The click was followed by a flash. Damn it! He had forgotten to disable the flash. The guards below spotted the glint from the window and immediately rushed towards Rico's room. With their credentials, his door would be opened within a minute. He looked outside and saw men sprinting toward the building. Now he had to move fast. He stopped the recorder and yanked out the cassette. Slinging the camera around his neck, he bolted from the room. Yes, abandoning the equipment hurt. But if they arrested him with all that material, he'd never see the money, the newspaper spread, or the special edition. Most likely he'd disappear into prison for a very long time. And that appealed to him least of all. Rico dashed up the stairs. There were two reasons for that. First, there was nowhere else to run. Going down meant running directly into the minister's men, so upward it had to be, to the roof, and then either escape or... Second, his kid was waiting on the rooftop. Rico always brought the kid along on jobs like these. For several reasons, nobody suspects a child. A child can carry material unnoticed and deliver it where it needs to go. They had already pulled the trick several times before. Rico sitting in prison while the article he was accused of writing appeared in print. A perfect alibi, and the work completed. He had ordered the boy to wait on the roof of the neighboring building. As Rico climbed upward, he thought furiously, rewinding the film in the camera as he ran. It had to be done quickly. To hell with the unfinished roll. He only needed one shot, and to make sure it wasn't exposed. Another problem. He had forgotten to bring the case he normally used. He always carried it. A hollow 1 kilogram contraption, palm-sized, designed to carry objects across distances when thrown. It remained in his room. So he needed another solution. Below, he could already hear the voices and shouting of his pursuers threatening him, but he still had a lead. He rewound the film and burst onto the roof. Tearing the camera from his neck and removing the film, he hurled the camera into the street below. They didn't need to know he'd had one. The roof door stood open, though from the rooftop side it could be jammed shut with a plank. Rico took full advantage of that. It would buy him time. The moment he finished, pounding erupted against the door. Then came gunshots. Rico's time was running out. He sprinted to the edge of the roof. On the neighboring rooftop stood his boy. Rico shouted to him only once. "To the editor!" Then the police found Rico standing on the rooftop with his hands raised. They quickly cuffed him and escorted him to the police car that had arrived outside the hotel. Rico was shoved into the back seat while two representatives of the minister climbed in beside him. All his equipment was placed in the boot. Naturally, they searched him on the roof, but they found nothing. That was probably why Rico sat there with a faint smirk. They had found nothing. They possessed his tools, of course. They could classify them however they liked, even call the listening rifle a lethal weapon. Rico didn't care. He smiled tensely, yet with relief. 30 minutes later, the police car stopped. Rico was led out. Waiting at the station entrance stood the police commissioner himself. The commissioner's eyes dropped to Rico's feet. He wore no shoes. The commissioner asked the minister's men where Rico's shoes were and why he wasn't wearing them, but they could offer no better explanation than that he simply hadn't had time to put them on while fleeing the room. Rico smiled. Then came the interrogation. They knew him well there. He denied everything. And when asked where the tapes were, he claimed he had panicked during the arrest and thrown them from the rooftop. Where they were now, he had no idea. The police searched the entire surrounding area and found nothing. The commissioner was furious, but Rico remained calm. He knew the procedure. Until matters were clarified, they'd keep him locked up for 72 hours. The important thing was that everything he hoped for happened before then. And what he hoped for was this. When Rico reached the roof, he realized neither the cassette nor the film roll could cross the distance between the buildings on their own. They were too light. The solution came instantly. He removed one shoe, shoved the film beneath the insole, and hurled it to the boy. The shoe sailed easily across and landed directly in the boy's hands. Then Rico repeated the process with the cassette tape. The second shoe flew just as cleanly into the boy's grasp. Rico shouted once more, "To the editor!" Within 5 seconds, the boy had vanished from the roof, stuffing both recordings into his pockets and discarding the incriminating size 43 shoes along the way. 5 seconds later, the police burst onto the roof and seized Rico. Rico lay on his bunk behind bars and waited. After 24 hours, he got his reward. His work had received a special edition. The entire station was reading La Bouche, which printed the full transcript of the conversation between the French Minister of Economy and Leclerc. On the front page blazed the photograph Rico had taken. He was triumphant. It was the finest work of his life. Now no one would dare lay a finger on him. Beneath the title, La Bouche, in the corner where the author's name usually appeared, was printed his photograph and the caption, "Rico Darderi, journalist. If he could, he would have smoked and drunk right then and there. In time, he would." The commissioner approached his cell and silently unlocked the door. "You're free." The only words the commissioner spoke. When Rico stepped outside, camera flashes and journalists were already waiting for him. Now he was a star without shoes,